This week, Keir Starmer gets tough on Nigel Farage.
He doesn't like Britain, doesn't believe in Britain, wants you to doubt it just as much as he does.
He delivers one of his greatest hits, but with a twist.
People like my dad. I think by now you know what he did for a living.
And Chris Mason's dentist resigns in disgust at his eating habits at Labour Party conference.
Wow, that's brave.
This is like an ASMR video.
We'll discuss all of that and what else we learned this week on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And Chris in the studio.
Faisal in the Newscast studio.
And please welcome Professor Jane Green, who's got many job titles. I'll read them out. Director of Nuffield Politics Research Centre at Oxford and President of the British Polling Council.
Oh, you missed a few, but thank you very much.
And I just discovered you're in a band. You're in a band.
The risk register.
Exactly. Can we download your material?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Not that big.
Okay, right. But let's focus
Work on it.
Let's focus on your political analysis for this episode.
Okay, that sounds good.
And I should say we did an episode of Newscast, the podcast, which you can listen to on BBC Sounds now, with the latest from the terror incident in Manchester. So we have been keeping an eye on that. But in this episode, we're going to look back at some of the political events of the week because, Chris, you and I spent half of it in Liverpool at the Labour Party conference.
Yeah.
How do you think Keir Starmer has emerged from that?
I think, speaking to those around him and indeed speaking to him there, he's pleased that they have focused their pitch, if you like, their political pitch on reform. The Prime Minister's been getting a lot of heat privately from some pretty senior figures around him saying it was the Labour offer was still too fuzzy in their view, particularly up against Nigel Farage, who paints in the most primary of colours. We've seen a build-up to this argument in terms of Labour making the case that their real opponents are reform rather than the Conservatives, which they kept labelling as irrelevant. But it came together, I think, in that conference speech. Speaking to folk since that speech, those who welcomed it say that's good, but will he stick to it? Because, you don't change the political narrative in one speech. Most people miss most of what politicians do most of the time. In other words, does he keep prosecuting that argument in the next 6 to 9 months, particularly the countdown to the elections in Scotland and Wales and indeed locally in England next May? And to what effect? And the sharpening of the language, I think, was particularly striking, not least the row that then bubbled up with Nigel Farage on reform about exactly that.
Jane, you spend your whole life crunching data about how the electorate think about things. What data will Number 10 Downing Street have crunched to help them inform that conference speech that he gave?
Oh, that's a fascinating question, Adam, because I've been wondering if they are crunching the same data as us. Because our analysis of voting behaviour and defections from Labour, so people that voted Labour in 2024 and no longer intend to vote Labour, tells a kind of two-pronged story. One is that Labour's vote is splintering in all directions, but the smallest proportion is to reform. So before the conference, one had to wonder why they were going for reform voters so much. That's not about the attack on reform, but that's just about which voters are they most worried about. And I think there might have been an assumption that they could almost rely on the left to sort of rally around Labour again if they see reform as the main threat. So that's clearly one of the things that they're thinking. But it was curious how much they looked like they were going for reform voters, because that's really tricky for Labour. The other risk with all of this, and it is high risks, but then obviously you've got to make a choice. And frankly, you can't ignore Farage and you can't ignore the polls. But the other big risk is that the Conservative voters are still leaving the Conservative Party. Now, that is extraordinary because, it's not extraordinary when you think about the context, but if historically you don't normally see the main opposition party losing support when the governing party is losing support. So Conservative voters are still switching to reform, and Conservative voters were switching to reform between 2019 and 2024. So that's a cumulative loss on the right. Now, if you then tell everybody, because obviously Labour is not just talking to Labour voters, they're talking to everyone. If you tell Conservative voters reform is the main opposition party on the right, then perhaps reform looks like the viable party to choose rather than the Conservatives. That's very bad for Labour. Very, very bad for Labour, because Labour can lose so many constituencies just because Conservative voters moved to reform in greater numbers.
And it is interesting because actually when you're in Labour Party conference in the hall and surrounded by Labour activists, you sort of feel like it's a message to Labour activists.
Yeah.
And okay, you're constantly thinking about the rest of the country because you're going to interpret it on the 6 and 10 o'clock news and the Today programme. But when you're in there, the thing that's in front of you is the activists cheering the messages. I think I sometimes forget that he is speaking to the whole country at that point.
I mean, he's hoping to, right? He's hoping that someone's listening. I think Chris is absolutely right. We can obsess about a speech and it's really important. It tells us about the direction and the strategy and the intentions. But the real test, the proof of the pudding, is whether it gets outside of the conference hall and whether it's repeated and whether it's prosecuted over and over and over again. But there was such a lot that was in that speech that also was for the left. And I think that was what was fascinating, that there were two kind of vacuums, weren't there? One was this vacuum over kind of, there's a lot of racism and racist language and things are being normalised here and nobody else is saying anything about this on the left of politics to try to counter that. So I think that was one of the things that he was trying to do. The other one was, of course, give people on the left a reason to vote for them. And I think that does speak to what we see in our analysis. And it's not just our analysis of British election study data. Of course, you see it in polling right across the piece, that Labour's vote was splintering from the left. And Labour's biggest losses are still to undecided. So they really needed, and I still think this is I'm still very unclear about this. They really needed to give people a sense of what Labour was for. And it's not, is Labour for tolerance and economic growth? I wouldn't say economic growth is the thing that people worried about the most. I think it's their own finances, their own worries about their own financial well-being, cost of living and everything else.
Well, and people don't link the economy as a whole growing to their own personal circumstances.
I often think, and forgive me for saying this, but I often think, well, if I think something's nuanced and I'm an academic and I'm meant to do nuance, then I'm not sure that somebody who's not like me is going. It was a very nuanced argument about how growth translates into, people's kind of daily lives. And in our own analysis, we've been running some additional surveys with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Absolutely fascinating. Economic growth is the top thing that people don't understand as well. Right? So if you ask how's GDP, how's economic growth going, that's the one with the highest proportion of people that's saying, I don't know.
Right.
What I know is how I feel about the cost of living, how I feel about inflation and prices, and people are more willing to talk about.
And there wasn't a lot about the cost of living in Starmer's speech. There was one line, wasn't there, when he talked about the things that make life good, like going out for a meal or having a trip somewhere.
Yeah,
and
he
that
did mention economic security, which was a personal moment for me, but because it's something I've been talking about for absolutely yonks now. The importance of this.
And Faisal, I suppose you would be watching Rachel Reeves' speech as much as Keir Starmer's speech for clues about the economy. Yeah. And did we get any clues for the next few months?
To pick up some of what Jane said, I think what I heard there, which I wondered why we haven't had this earlier, was this attempt to inject some degree of optimism in a world, politically, we've talked about this before, where there's a lot of doom and gloom. Some of it came from the government itself just over a year ago. And I think from their perspective, it hasn't really stopped. They expect, and not just for political purposes, I'd imagine, where they want people to feel a little bit better about things. Interest rates have been cut. Real income, so that's after inflation, have started to go up. No boom here, but certainly when they're going down, that's a bad thing. Right? So the absence of that bad thing is good. The absence of a sort of fiscal crisis, a mini budget style situation is also good. But some sense of optimism, we can see in some of the economic statistics, this downtrodden vibe is having an impact. People's savings rates are high. They're in double digit. Over 10% was the latest figure that came out just this week. And that is what we sort of associate with pandemic level stress. So people are a bit worried about the economy. And given we've had 5 interest rate cuts, given that real incomes are growing, given that the economy has been growing, even if people don't feel it so much, consumer confidence and things like that are lagging behind. And so I thought I thought I'd hear it more from the Chancellor. We heard a bit of it from the Chancellor. Then the Prime Minister really went for it on this sort of optimistic tale of what Britain can be.
Oh, so all that stuff about Britain's a great country because the people that chop the oranges at halftime for their kids' football match, that was actually intended to stimulate a feel-good factor that makes people go out and spend money. and I'm making a comedy version of it.
Yeah. You're making a very sort of direct, punch-through argument there. But yeah, in a sense, I haven't heard them say that to me. But when I put together some of the things holding the economy back, the economy should be doing better given the interest rate cuts. We should see consumer confidence ticking up. It has not ticked up. There's some very interesting analysis saying that some of this might be attached to people's political beliefs, particularly amongst the over 50s, where there's that is the central part of low consumer confidence is the over 50s. And is there something to do with political beliefs about the country being rubbish, basically? Even though things are very stressed for younger people, in fact, their consumer confidence has gone up with their incomes. So I think I detect that there could have been a conscious strategy to G people up a little bit. I'm also conscious of the return of the B word, Brexit. And you think about Jane's analysis of who they're trying to win with this strategy. I was very struck in the interviews by the Prime Minister, in Rachel Reeves' speech, this thing about the youth scheme with Europe, really leaning in to Brexit having not worked. I'll just put it like that, in a way they maybe wouldn't have done before the election because they didn't want to offend those reform voters, right?
I think there's something in that, not least because I think they realise that they cannot sharpen a political argument with reform and then walk past the question of Brexit, I think, coupled with the fact I think they've been inclined to want to do it for a while and have just been trying to find the space to do it. Just picking up on your point about the optimism and the oranges, there's an overlap here. No, but the oranges thing is an interesting part of this because I think there's an overlap. I think we mentioned this on Newscast the other day, Adam. So firstly, I think there was an awareness that they did want to sound more optimistic, but didn't want to fall into the trap that they felt that Rishi Sunak occasionally fell into, which was to seize upon a particular bit of economic data, and this is to caricature what he would have done, but to the political danger of overdoing the positive if people are feeling negative. But I think where the overlap with the oranges comes in, and indeed the image from Shropshire, the rolling English countryside of Shropshire.
More on that later.
Which was this image that popped up all around the conference centre in Liverpool, was this articulation that they were attempting to find around how they see patriotism in this era where there is contest around flags, and we saw the Union flag and indeed the flags of the UK nations very prominently in the audience during the Prime Minister's speech. So I think there's an overlap there. I think that to overdo seizing on that quarter of orange is to both lean into a sense of optimism, but also identity, belonging,
what was it
and who we are. And I think the word that neatly encapsulates both of those is pride. Yeah, that's what they were trying to get to.
This question about mentioning Brexit, it's partly because people have come to the conclusion that Brexit hasn't worked for many people. It's partly because Labour's voters are overwhelmingly those voters who either voted Remain or would again. But it's also something else, isn't it? There's two things, I think. One is people just didn't want to go there again.
Oh, completely.
They didn't want to go there again. So imagine framing another general election campaign as a little bit like that one, where you've got kind of the same guy, Nigel Farage, on the Brexit side, promising a load of stuff, just as in Brexit, that a lot of that did not happen. And then you've got this kind of binary choice. I mean, that's how I kind of almost think about the next election. But that
does explain something that I'd found a bit mysterious the weekend before Labour Party conference, where Rachel Reeves's big interview, the centrepiece in the Times was the youth mobility scheme with the EU, which has already been announced, not actually negotiated with the EU, but we knew a version of it was coming. And that's the thing that she sort of splashed on. And then ministers were talking about a lot those days around it as well. I'm like, why? But now I understand why.
Well, there's the dividing line politically. Economically, they hope that it will unlock a return of serve from the Europeans that can open up some economic wins. For example, getting rid of almost all checks on food imports and exports. The Prime Minister said that in some of his interviews that would be a win for food prices. Help British manufacturing industry. Be part of consortia that are bidding for the massive boom now in rearming Europe. There's going to be tens of billions, hundreds of billions. You want British manufacturers at the heart of that. At the minute, we're not allowed to be part of these consortium. That is open as a negotiating point. That will have been heard in Brussels. Now, traditionally, we may have said, only a year ago, we'd have said, well, then there's all sorts of, are you getting too close to Brussels? Is that going to offend the reform voters? Are they going to go there? And I just note, Mr. Burnham popping up in a and saying he thought we were going to rejoin in his lifetime, which you never would have got a senior Labour figure even going there a year ago.
I mean, Andy Burnham was saying a lot.
No, he was saying a lot, but I'm just saying, like the dynamic. If this is a new dynamic, if we're right or wrong, if we're right, then coming up on that side of the Labour Party, which is where the action's going to be for the government, becomes a bit of a competition. And do you get the same as happened for the Tories in the last decade, happened to Labour being outflanked?
And Chris, this is a ridiculous question to ask because I don't know how you can't peer into like Keir Starmer's brain directly, but he's under a lot of fire. We had that, so he's very unpopular in the polls, although we could talk about whether everyone is always going to be that unpopular in the rest of time when the next 10 prime ministers are going to be unpopular. He'd just seen Andy Burnham come along and sort of like make a tilt for the crown. You sat down for an interview with him after he'd done his conference speech. Like, how did he seem? And I know you can't read too much into like how someone seems, but I'm just intrigued, like, how does he wear all of this?
I think he was chipper and relieved. I mean, I spoke to him within about half an hour, 40 minutes of him finishing the speech. So the adrenaline was probably pumping through him. But I think he felt pretty chipper. I think he felt, and those around him felt pretty chipper, that the nature of how the whole Andy Burnham thing played out meant that it actually served to rally a lot of the Parliamentary Labour Party behind Keir Starmer, even though a lot of them are very alive to what they see as his weaknesses. And there was the thing I came away with politically from the whole conference was a sense of how deep, wide and senior questions run about whether he's the best front man for the job they've set themselves, which is taking on reform.
Yeah, because all of us speculating about the Prime Minister being replaced at one point, like we all do that. Like cabinet ministers aren't normally meant to do that with journalists.
And privately, they are. It's as simple as that. Now, that doesn't mean things will change instantly. It may also mean that things blow over because, party conferences in particular are sort of febrile places of political gossip. But that is being talked about by people from the cabinet down, particularly in the context of what happens next summer after those elections in May, and where Labour and Reform, and indeed others, but where those two parties are by then.
And Faisal, I saw you posted on social media on X, formerly known as Twitter, that when Nick Robinson had interviewed Keir Starmer the next day, the bit you picked out was Starmer saying, I'm looking at how much we're spending on sickness benefits, and I'm looking at how much is being spent on young people with mental health conditions. And I'm wondering if maybe that money might be spent better on treatment and support for people with mental health conditions, as opposed to just cash handouts in the form of benefits. And what do you think that signals?
Well, and he said he was looking at it too. So obviously the context to this is that they had a little tilt at welfare cuts. Let's call them cuts. They called it reform, but it was cuts. And then they retreated, delayed. And I've never thought that their appetite to try and do something in this area has gone away. I think what we have seen since the summer has been a reframing of the argument to say, well, what we will do is reform. And he used the phrase moral argument. So the moral argument won't be that we need to save the money. The moral argument will be it is a disgrace that young people go straight from college or university and are on benefits related to mental health, because at that point, the best medicine, as they would see it, would be to be in a workplace or training or something like that, and then have a career. If you're on benefits, he used this statistic, there is a significant likelihood that you could be on benefits for life if you're then in the early 20s. So you make that argument, you then find some money to invest, you've got to invest in the mental health services, and then you save money on the welfare bill. But what does that actually mean? The end part of that, does that mean actually taking those benefits away from young people? Does it mean treating the benefit system differently for mental health versus physical health? Then you get into some, over to Chris at this point.
Also, none of this is imminent, Chris, because Stephen Timms, the minister, is doing this big review as a result of the failure to pass the welfare reforms from earlier on in the year. So actually, there's probably still another year of working this out.
Yeah, I think that's probably broadly right. They're definitely determined to have another go. You could see that in the signalling when Pat McFadden was sent to be Work and Pension Secretary in the reshuffle, but also speaking to very senior folk, they are going to have another go. They acknowledged that they got the politics badly wrong last time because all of the focus was on saving money rather than making that moral argument, as the Prime Minister put it. I think also into the mix is the movement that's going to come on the two-child benefit cap relatively soon, next couple of months, probably at the budget. Quite what that amounts to is still in the works. Is there some sort of tapering? Does it go to 3 children? How do they pay for it? Significantly expensive. Prime Minister's always argued it's something he wanted to do but felt that he couldn't afford. Obviously, that's a choice, but that was how he framed it. I did put it to someone quite senior in government the other day. I said, if you move on the two-child benefit cap, given how much desire there is within the party that happens, does that buy you goodwill around other changes? And this person, who's been around the block a bit and was mildly cynical, said, "No, they just swallow that and still argue about the other stuff." But I think they will try and use a movement on that with arguments around the nature of the budget, which are unavoidable, I think, in a sort of fiscal context into the short and medium term. Not least, remember, those changes they couldn't get through were about slowing the rate of the increase in the benefits bill because of the projected number of people going onto it. So I think they'll repackage the argument. There'll be some things that will serve, they hope, to persuade some of the sceptics before. But it'll be a tussle again because it's not an easy thing for a Labour government to do.
Then let's turn our attention to the Conservatives. I only discovered today that actually their conference is in Manchester. I thought I was going to go to Birmingham, so I'm glad I checked. Thanks, BBC Verify. And we'll talk about the Conservatives on Newscast, the podcast, quite a lot in the next few days and probably next week once the conference is all wrapped up and it's all happened. But Jane, the thing that was announced today by Kemi Badenoch is that she would repeal the Climate Change Act, which is this previous Labour government era piece of legislation, which was supported by lots of the other parties at the time, that set up the Independent Climate Change Committee that had these binding climate change targets for each parliament and kind of like defines what we do as a country about getting to net zero eventually. Do you think Kemi Badenoch has done that just because she just doesn't like it and it's sort of that's her personal thing, or does she think there's actually some electoral advantage to doing something like this?
Wow. I mean, Chris, you got the question of what was in Keir Starmer's head, and you can have the question of what's in Kemi Badenoch's head. The deeper issue here, isn't it, is like Kemi Badenoch is really struggling to have cut through. She's really struggling within the party, let alone outside the party. And it's extraordinary, actually, to be honest, that this would be the thing. I mean, it's not going to be the thing that she's going to spend the whole of conference talking about, and we'll have to wait to see. But fundamentally, the Conservative Party is trying to figure out if they're a party that goes harder on the right or whether they shouldn't do that. And that is amazing when you think, is this a party that sees itself as the natural party of opposition? Or is it a party that's vying for voters on the fringes of British politics? And if you just looked at that one statement alone, you would say, well, this is a leader who thinks that she needs to be on the fringes.
Right.
Not in the mainstream of what people are worried about.
The majority of voters are actually in favour of something like the Climate Change Act.
Yes, and also that the majority of voters aren't thinking about the Climate Change Act. They want to see a party in opposition that is a potential credible alternative government that's talking about public services, cost of living, the things that people really care about. And, what I've been told, and, I'm an academic and I study analysis and evidence, but, but the little bits of things that I hear about Kemi Badenoch is that she's particularly comfortable on these sort of culture wars kinds of issues. Now, the environment's not traditionally a culture wars issue, but it's not your sort of traditional left-right bread and butter economics. And that she's veered away from those kinds of bread and butter economic issues. And what she's been saying is, well, people aren't going to look at us now, so we need to take a pause and come up with things and do a deep kind of stock take and all the rest of it and come out later. Now, that would be a bit of a bold thing to say in normal political times. In political times when there is a party on the right that is gobbling up half of your vote, I mean, their vote has literally halved and gone to Reform in the last year.
She doesn't have time.
She can't do that. I mean, that's just, that is just too little too late. So I think she's missing opportunities, or the Conservatives are missing opportunities and not, frankly, understanding the depth of their difficulties.
The thing I'll be most interested to see and feel is a better word, is, and I know this is one of the cliches of party conference season, but the sort of mood of the party at its conference. Because last year, the Conservative conference had a sort of survivor's elation vibe to it. It was quite upbeat.
And the leadership contest, which meant there was a bit of excitement.
The leadership contest gave it a sense of purpose. Activists felt almost like they had their conference back because there was far few kind of corporate lobbyists around and all that kind of stuff.
They were seeing Labour struggle and thought they would be the natural beneficiaries.
Yes, because exactly. The Labour had a bumpy start, all the rows about passes for glasses and all that stuff of a year ago. They were having a battle of ideas, which any member of a political party tends to love. So how's it going to feel for them this year when they've gone backwards from a dire position? Yeah. And they're not in a internal contest. I mean, I think the way I interpret Kemi Badenoch's approach, both to the Climate Change Act, to this review that she set up to look into the European Convention on Human Rights, which we're expecting to conclude, and for her to decide that the party will advocate withdrawal, is that this is authentic Badenochism or whatever. This is how she believes politics should be done. She's making an argument that says that hers is the only truly conservative party. So she argues that Reform are, as she would see it, fiscally incontinent, throwing lots of money around in terms of some of their spending commitments. Reform would obviously push back on that, but that's her political argument. But the evidence suggests at the moment it's not working. I think it's also true to say historically, certainly in contemporary history, there's never been a harder time to lead the Conservative Party.
And I would say on this argument about climate change, I think that the Conservatives would bet that it is going to become an economic issue, or they're trying to make it an economic issue and a cost of living issue, because we're now at the stage where the sorts of changes in the transition will start affecting ordinary households, whether it's the heat pump or cladding or your electric vehicle. These are decisions made by consumers that governments have to make. And I question, this will be a real test of the government. Are they willing to push against on this hard enough to almost force householders to change their homes? How much resistance are you going to get from that? There's a lot of political potential benefits.
Is this going to be like a giant version of, do you remember the Uxbridge by-election after Boris Johnson resigned as an MP? The whole thing boiled down to like the ultra-low emission zone.
Well, I'm not saying it's going to work necessarily, but you can see the calculation. And the question for me is, how far do they go? Because you have Reform saying things like, writing letters to the guys bidding on the wind farm contracts, saying we will rip these up, which is a frankly extraordinary thing for an opposition party that aspires to government to say we're going to rip up contracts. Now, is there some sort of Dutch auction here between the Conservatives and Reform as to how far they go along this path?
I think there's a bit of that, and I think just to extend your thought one further on, is that some Conservatives anticipate with some of these targets getting quite real in terms of they're no longer on the horizon, they are much more imminent, that the government may, so they calculate, reach a point where they think, is this doable? Right. Is it practical? Is it politically viable? And then they might be able to say, look, well, we spotted this coming. But then who knows?
So much to talk about for the next 35 years. Now, talking about horizons, Chris, you mentioned this picture of the rolling hills in Shropshire that was all over the Labour Party conference. We discovered where it was. It's in a place that I thought was called Rattling Hope, but we had a message from newscaster David, who lives there, and says it's actually pronounced Ratchup, even though it is written
I lived
Rattling
in Shropshire
Hope.
for a really long time and I didn't know that.
Always learning. Always
Every
learning.
day's a school day.
As in, you didn't know that's how it was pronounced, or you'd not heard of the place?
I didn't know that was how it was pronounced.
Ratchup. And he says, David, the drive or walk over the Stretton Hills from there to Carding Mill Valley is highly recommended. And that's two other places I probably mispronounced.
No, you did fine on Carding Mill Valley.
Thank you very much. And thanks for coming into the studio, Jane.
Thanks for having me.
Nice to see you, Faisal.
Great to be here.
And Chris, I'll see you in Manchester.
Manchester.